So I wanted to start out with last night. It's official. Trump is running for president again. Did you watch his announcement?
I had a speech at the Lincoln Center here in New York City, but I caught clips of it. And the president has every right to stand for election again. But I really do believe, as I've traveled around this country over the last 2 years, that in the wake of the failed policies of the Biden administration, that the American people long to go back to the successful policies of the Trump-Pence administration, where we created 7 million good-paying jobs, secured our border, supported our military, and had conservatives on our courts. But Jill, I have a genuine sense that the American people are looking for new leadership that could unite our country around our highest ideals, that would reflect the respect and civility the American people show to one another every day, while still advancing the policies that we advanced during those years of service.
We'll circle back to that in a little bit, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the midterms and the results. What do you think happened? Why did Republicans do so badly?
Well, I was a member of Congress, as I write in my book, the last time that we won the majority back from Nancy Pelosi, and I like to say a win is a win. I would have liked to have seen a lot more Republicans elected to the House of Representatives, but I celebrate the election of a new Republican majority, and I think the day that Nancy Pelosi hands the Speaker's gavel to Speaker Kevin McCarthy will be a great day, not just for Republicans, but for the country. I think that new Republican majority will have the opportunity to stop the gusher of spending and bad policies that have set off the worst inflation in 40 years, have launched a war on energy that's caused gasoline prices to go through the roof, and also to take a strong stand for our national defense and our military at a time that the Biden administration and Democrats have been flatlining spending. So I welcome the success of Republicans in the House, but it wasn't quite the red wave that we all had hoped for. I certainly would have liked to see us win a majority in the Senate, but my conclusion looking at the results, after having traveled to some 35 states, campaigning for candidates for the House and Senate and for governor, is the candidates that were focused on the future, focused on the challenges the American people are facing today and the solutions to those challenges, did quite well. But candidates, by contrast, that were focused on the past, particularly those that were trying to relitigate the last election, did not do as well. And so I believe a message coming out of the midterm elections is that the American people want change, but that the Republican Party, to meet this moment, needs to be seen as the party of the future.
You're talking about those candidates not focused on the future. Do you blame Trump for elevating those people?
Well, certainly the president's continued efforts to relitigate the last election played a role, but each individual candidate is responsible for their own campaign. And I really do see a common denominator, Jill, where we had women and men that were running, that were truly focused on moving the country forward, focused on an agenda on the future, built on our common sense conservative values. They did well, but in one race after another, where candidates were focused on the past, were using the rhetoric, not just of the former president, but frankly the rhetoric that Hillary Clinton and Democrats were using after our election in 2016. I know the media's attention has been greatly on those that have been critical and questioned the 2020 election, but as I recount in my book, So Help Me God, Hillary Clinton and leading Democrats said that the 2016 election was stolen for years after our election.
Hillary Clinton came out and conceded immediately after her loss.
They did, but it didn't change the rhetoric. For literally years, they accused us of conspiring with a foreign power to win the election, and they questioned whether President Donald Trump was a legitimate president. So I think all of that rhetoric, we ought to strengthen election integrity around the country, but I think it's time that in both parties we were willing to accept the will of the American people and move forward.
Just to be clear, I mean, your administration concluded that Russia had interfered in the election by, using bots on social media and intervening.
Right, and I write about that in So Help Me God, that in fact I spoke directly and firmly to Vladimir Putin about just that. But what our intelligence community found, Jill, was that Russia had meddled on both sides of the election. But what Hillary Clinton and other Democrats said, that the election was stolen, that for 2.5 years the American people endured a Russia investigation that suggested that the campaign had conspired with Russia, which of course turned out to be completely false.
Well, let's talk about the consequences of Trump's rhetoric on the topic. You write in your book about Trump's reckless words, and you say that he endangered your family who were with you at the Capitol that day and everyone who was at the Capitol that day. And so my question is, what should be the consequences for those actions?
Well, I believe everyone that rioted at the Capitol needs to be held to the strictest account of the law. I said it that day, and it continues to be my position. I'll never forget the simmering indignation that I felt that day, seeing those sights on the cell phones as we gathered in the loading dock below the Senate chamber. I couldn't help but think, not this, not here, not in America. But with regard to others, with regard to those in the political debate, I think that's up to the American people. I truly do. And look, I'll always be proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration. For 4.5 years, President Trump was not just my president, he was my friend. And we worked closely together to advance the policies that we'd been elected to serve. And I think it won that historic election in 2016. It won us 10 million more votes in 2020. And it didn't end well. That tragic day in January will always be a day of great sadness for me. Sadness about what had happened to our relationship, the bad advice the president was accepting from a group of lawyers that, as I write in my book, should never have been allowed on the White House grounds, let alone in the Oval Office. And I do believe that when I saw that tweet come across that criticized me directly at a time that a riot was raging in the Capitol hallways, that the president's words were reckless, and they endangered my family and everyone at the Capitol building. But quite frankly, Jill, I didn't have time for it. And the president had decided to be a part of the problem. I was determined to be a part of the solution. I literally set that aside, gathered the Republican and Democrat leadership on a conference call, and we began to work the problem. And at their request, I engaged leadership at the Pentagon, leadership at the Justice Department, and thanks to the courage of law enforcement, Capitol Police, and federal officials, we quelled the violence in a matter of hours. We reconvened the Congress the very same day, and a day of tragedy became a triumph of freedom.
Do you believe then that he is fit to be president again?
I think that's a question for the American people.
Do you think that man should be back in the Oval Office?
I think we will have better choices in 2024, and I'm very confident that Republican primary voters will choose wisely. Look, I think no one could have beaten Hillary Clinton in 2016 except Donald Trump. You'll read in my book, I had endorsed another candidate in the Indiana primary in 2016, but voters knew better. Voters knew that Donald Trump brought a brand of conservatism and also politics that could meet the decades-long Clinton political machine and prevail, and he did. But I have every confidence in the next year and more that Republican primary voters will sort it out. We'll elect leadership fitted to the moment that'll help lead our country back to what makes us strong and prosperous. We did it once, we'll do it again.
I want to ask you about, I was always, as I covered you in the White House, was always so interested in this very interesting dynamic between you and the former president. And I was struck in reading here your essay, Confessions of a Negative Campaigner, where you talked about how you'd been disappointed in yourself for the first or second campaign that you'd run, and vowed to never negative campaign again. You said it deprive people of the opportunity to hear about important issues. And so I just want to understand, and if you can explain to us how you square that approach. Also, you're obviously a very religious man. How do you square that, and how did you stand by Trump for 4.5 years when you, as a running mate, he went after Ted Cruz's wife's looks. He repeatedly went after John McCain, said he wasn't a hero. At one point, aides had to physically hide the USS John McCain because they didn't want Trump to see it because they worried about how he would respond. How did you stand next to him?
Well, thank you for recounting my lessons learned. I tried to be very humble and candid. That as a Christian in my early campaigns, I regretted having engaged in negative personal attacks. And I wrote that essay after I left active politics, really to clear my conscience, not knowing if I would ever return to active politics again. I just simply wanted, I wanted to make it clear to people that I knew I'd let my ambition get ahead of the values of my faith, which required to deal with others the way that we want to be dealt with, treat others the way we want to be treated. But I must tell you that during my years in Congress and years in government, I always tried to adhere to that, not just in my campaigns, but in the way we conducted ourselves. Which, Jill, you know me well. It's not to say that I don't love a good debate. I love to debate the issues, but I've stayed away from negative personal attacks in the course of my career. But when Donald Trump called and asked me to consider joining the ticket, as I recount, and so help me God, my first question was, I wanted to know whether or not our families could connect, could work together. And secondly, I wanted to know what the job description was. And we traveled to Bedminster, my wife and our daughter Charlotte, and we spent every bit of several days with them. And I must tell you, while our styles are very different, he's a brash New Yorker, and I'm a small-town guy from southern Indiana. We made a connection as a family. And I also had a clear sense of what he was looking for in a vice president. He actually, as I write, said that he wanted a vice president who would be active, meaning active in the legislative process, active around the country, and representing America around the world. And President Trump kept that promise to me every single day for 4 years. And I'll always be grateful for that. But Jill, I joined that ticket because I thought the country was in a lot of trouble. That if we stayed on the path of more spending, more government, more regulation, a weaker and appeasing America abroad, that the America that I had grown up in would be a distant memory in a matter of another decade or more. And so I joined the ticket to support Donald Trump in the candidacy that he was nominated to run. And I, as his vice president, I believed it was my role to be loyal to the president. He was not only my president, he was my friend. I only had one higher loyalty, and that was to God and to the Constitution. And so every step of the way I squared it was I believed that I had been elected vice president to support the presidency that Donald Trump had been elected to advance. It wasn't exactly the style of presidency that I would have advanced had I been the first name on the ballot. But it was his presidency, and I was there to support him and help him. And until that fateful day in January 2021, I sought to do just that.
By never speaking out, by never criticizing his words, his actions, didn't you in effect condone them?
Well, I think if you read the book, you'll see I actually criticized the president's words before I was added to the national ticket, and in the Access Hollywood moment, I said very plainly that I could not defend and would not condone what the president had said. I called on him to apologize to the American people, which he did. As you'll read, the president called me after I issued a very firm statement and said that it was a little rough. And I told him, as I would tell him more than once over the next 4 years. You got to be you, I got to be me.
There's another moment that really struck me after January 6th, where you say that the two of you parted amicably, that you had conversations, that you'd had several phone calls after you left office, and that it was really only after he continued to kind of stoke the lies about the election that you decided that the two of you would part ways. Why, after January 6th, after his supporters literally stormed the Capitol trying to kill you, after he never bothered to call and ask how you were doing, if your family was safe, if your wife was safe, if your children, your daughter was safe, why would you be okay parting on good terms?
You know, I've often told people I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. As a Christian, forgiveness is not optional. In the days after January 6th, the morning after, the president issued a statement saying the right things, condemning the rioter, committing to a peaceful transfer of power. He would address the nation in the days ahead and put our administration on the proper public track. But I'll be honest with you, Jill, I was angry. But the Bible says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And I prayed to do that, although it was easier said than done. I made no effort to reach out to the president and had no intention of reaching out to him. But 5 days after January 6th, his son-in-law and daughter came into my office and said the president would like the opportunity to speak to me. And I told him, if he has something to say to me, I'll listen. And I walked down to the Oval Office. I walked back to that dining room that we'd spent so many hours.
The dining room where you spent January 6th not calling any federal officials, not checking in on you.
I walked in and his chief of staff was there, but he quickly left. And the president looked up at me and said, how's Karen? How's Charlotte? He said, I just heard that they'd been at the Capitol with you. And I looked at him and I said, they're fine, Mr. President. They never left. They refused to leave. And then he said to me, in a voice that was much more faint than usual, he said, were you scared? And I said, no, I was angry. I said, you and I had our differences. But I said, seeing those rioters tearing apart the Capitol infuriated me. And he kind of shook his head and said, yeah. For the balance of about 90 minutes, we talked. I was very direct with the president. I made it clear to him that I believed that I did my duty that day. And I sensed genuine remorse on his part. The president and I had forged not only a good working relationship, but a friendship over 4.5 years. We worked together literally every day. But he was different in that time. I encouraged him to take the matter to prayer. The president told me many times that he was a believer. I told him he ought to take this time to pray. In the days that followed, it was simply back to work on our part. We made plans to travel to military bases to thank our troops and otherwise go through the process of bringing an orderly conclusion to our office in the West Wing and at the White House. But in our last meeting in that dining room, the president and I were speaking briefly about official matters, and I could sense that he was still downcast. And I reminded him that I was praying for him. And he was dismissive at first. And when we ended our meeting a little while later, I stood up and stopped in the doorway. I looked at him seated at the end of that small table and said, I guess there's just two things that we're probably always going to disagree on. And he looked up and said, what? And I said, referred to my role on January 6th. And then I said, I'm also never going to stop praying for you. And he looked up at me from seated at that table, smiled faintly and said, "That's right. Don't ever change." And it was on that foundation of grace that we did part amicably, Jill. I continue to pray for the president. I continue to work through the feelings about that day. But we parted the White House amicably, finished the people's business. And in the weeks that followed, from time to time, he would call me to speak and check in. But when he returned to criticizing me and others who had upheld the Constitution that day, I just decided it'd be best to go our separate ways. And we have.
So what does that look like for you in the future? You write in your book that so many good Americans and talented politicians reach for the brass ring of the presidency only to fall and fall hard, never to be heard from again. What's your plan going forward, and how do you prevent yourself from being the never to be heard from again?
Well, I wrote about that at the time, the first time I had more than a few people encouraging me to run for national office. We were trying to decide whether to go home and try and lead Indiana as governor or step into the national debate. And, as I wrote in So Help Me God, anyone that doesn't admit to you that hearing their name mentioned for the highest office in the land means something to them isn't being honest with you. And anyone that tells you it doesn't fill them with some hesitation isn't being honest with themselves. So for me, it's always been trying to follow what our sense of calling is and just literally trusting God with whatever the outcome is. Early in my career, as I write in So Help Me God, we let our ambition get ahead of us. And we learned some hard lessons that I try and write about candidly. But when we packed our 3 kids up and sold our dream home and moved back to our hometown to run for Congress, when we moved home to run for governor of Indiana, when I said yes in a heartbeat to join the national ticket and run for election as vice president, it was out of a deep sense of calling on our part as a family. And so for us, we won't worry so much about outcomes. We'll try and take time as a family over the holidays. First time our family with 2 in the active duty military will be together in 3 years. And we'll give prayerful consideration to what our role might be in the days ahead. But I know our focus for me and Karen in whatever decision we make will be what is our sense of calling. We love this country. We've dedicated our lives to serving America. And whatever that sense of calling is, we'll go where we're called.
You certainly seem like you're laying the groundwork to go in that direction.
Well, I know it seems that way, but what we've been doing over the last 2 years is simply staying involved in the debate. The calling of my life is to advance the common sense conservative principles that I think have been the underpinning of America's strength and prosperity. And whatever role that we play in the future, I'm never going to stop fighting for the values that have called me into public service, and I'll never stop standing for the timeless principles enshrined in the American economy, principles of freedom and individual responsibility and values that make this country so great.
So just in 2 or 3 words, if I ask you, are you running for president in 2024?
I'll keep you posted.